Monica Harris, a young black federal prosecutor, started her morning in her downtown Atlanta apartment as the first rays of sunlight peeked over the city's skyline. She wasn't scheduled to be in court until 9 a.m., but Monica's years of experience in the legal field had instilled in her the importance of preparation. Her home reflected her meticulous nature. Case files neatly organized on her desk, her court attire hung and ready for the night before. Today, however, wasn't about a high-profile federal case. Instead, Monica was heading to municipal court to contest a parking ticket she firmly believed had been wrongly issued. Deciding to forego her usual formal court attire, she opted for a navy blue blazer over a crisp white blouse and black trousers, a polished but unstated look. Standing in front of her bathroom mirror, she carefully pinned back her natural hair, a recent shift she had embraced after years of straightening it. At 33, Monica's face carried the quiet determination that had seen her graduate at the top of her class from Howard Law School and secure her role as an assistant U.S. attorney. Grabbing a banana and her travel mug of coffee, she glanced at the sleek Mercedes she had bought as a reward for her hard work. The car symbolized her success, though she was accustomed to the surprised looks she received as a young black woman stepping out of such a vehicle. As Monica prepared for what she thought would be a simple court appearance, she had no idea that this ordinary morning would take a turn and expose the deeply rooted biases she had fought against her entire career. On her way to municipal court, Monica Harris, a federal prosecutor known for her meticulous attention to detail, found herself unexpectedly interrupted by a call from her boss. The voice on the other end belonged to the U.S. Attorney himself, a rare and serious occurrence. "Monica, I apologize for calling this early," he began, his tone urgent. "We've got a situation with the Thompson trafficking case. The defense just filed a last-minute motion, and we need your analysis immediately. The judge has given us until noon to respond." The Thompson case was one of the largest human trafficking prosecutions in Georgia's history, and Monica had played a pivotal role in building the case. Her mind raced as she responded. "Of course, sir. I'll review the documents and call you back with my analysis as soon as possible." The gravity of the situation shifted her focus entirely. Monica knew that the motion could jeopardize years of work, and she needed to act fast. Pulling into the parking lot of a small coffee shop, she opened her laptop and connected to her phone's hotspot. The documents were complex, filled with legal jargon and intricacies that required careful scrutiny. She worked quickly but thoroughly, taking detailed notes and drafting a preliminary response. Time slipped away unnoticed as Monica pored over the files, her focus unwavering. By the time she finished her review, she glanced at her watch and felt a pang of anxiety. It was 8:50 a.m. She had planned to arrive at the municipal court by 8:30 to ensure ample time for parking and locating the correct courtroom. Now, with only minutes to spare, she closed her laptop, packed her belongings, and resumed her journey. Traffic in downtown Atlanta added to her stress, and by the time Monica finally parked in the municipal court's crowded lot, it was already 9:10 a.m. She grabbed her carefully prepared documentation for the disputed parking ticket and hurried toward the courthouse. Despite the delay, Monica allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. Her boss had already sent a text thanking her for her swift and insightful analysis of the defense's motion. But as she rushed up the courthouse steps, her mind was already shifting back to the parking ticket dispute. Monica expected this to be a straightforward matter, one that would soon be resolved so she could return to her federal cases. What she couldn't anticipate was how her slightly tardy arrival would escalate into a confrontation with systemic bias and spark a series of events that would challenge not just her, but the very foundation of the justice system she had dedicated her life to upholding. Monica Harris entered the municipal courtroom at 9:10 a.m., slightly breathless from her hurried pace. The room was already filled with people, some dressed in formal business attire, others in casual wear, most of them there for minor infractions like parking tickets or traffic violations. The atmosphere was tense but orderly, with Judge Barrett presiding from his elevated bench, his expression stern as he addressed the cases before him. Monica approached the front of the courtroom, her documentation in hand, ready to explain her late arrival and present her evidence. However, as soon as she stepped forward, the judge's attention turned to her with a disapproving glare. "You must be Monica Harris," he said, his voice sharp. "Scheduled for 9 a.m., do you think your time is more valuable than the court's time, Miss Harris?" Before Monica could respond, Judge Barrett continued, his tone growing harsher. "This court has no patience for tardiness or disrespect for its schedule. You willfully disrupted the proceedings with your delay, and this behavior will not be tolerated." Monica, maintaining her professional composure, attempted to explain. "Your Honor, I apologize for my tardiness. I was delayed by an urgent matter involving a federal case I am handling. The Thompson human trafficking case required my immediate attention this morning." The judge cut her off with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Excuses, Miss Harris. Everyone in this courtroom has responsibilities. You are no different. This is a municipal court, and we expect all participants to show the same level of respect and punctuality." The scolding continued as Judge Barrett leaned forward, his tone dripping with condescension. "Perhaps a fine will remind you of the importance of respecting this institution. This court hereby imposes a $500 fine for your tardiness." The courtroom fell silent. Several people glanced at Monica with a mix of curiosity and unease, while others looked at the judge, clearly uncomfortable with his harshness. Monica stood her ground, her posture straight and her expression composed. This was not the first time she had faced prejudice in her career, but something about this moment felt different. More blatant, more personal. Judge Barrett's demeanor spoke volumes. He had barely glanced at Monica's neatly tailored blazer, professional documentation, or the confident way she carried herself. Instead, his assumptions seemed written all over his face. To him, she was not a seasoned federal prosecutor or a professional addressing a minor infraction. She was simply another late defendant, undeserving of respect. From his bench, Judge Barrett's voice boomed. "This fine should serve as a lesson to all present that the court's time is not to be trifled with. Dismissal of this behavior is unacceptable." His words, though directed at Monica, seemed meant to reinforce his authority to the entire room. James Wilson, the bailiff, an older black man who had worked in this courtroom for 15 years, watched the exchange with growing discomfort. He had seen this pattern too many times before. Judge Barrett's tone, the heightened fire, and his refusal to listen to Monica's explanation were not unfamiliar. In his experience, defendants who looked like Monica often received this kind of treatment, dismissive, hostile, and disproportionate. Catching Monica's eye briefly, James gave her a subtle look of understanding and solidarity. Monica, however, refused to be rattled. "Your Honor," she began again, her voice steady but firm, "I would like the opportunity to present my case regarding the parking ticket. I have photographic evidence showing contradictory signage at the location where the ticket was issued. Additionally—" "Miss Harris," the judge interrupted again, his tone growing colder. "This is not a negotiation. You were late, and you will pay the consequences. The court does not tolerate disregard for its rules or procedures." The fine was unusually steep for a tardiness penalty, and many in the courtroom knew it. Just last week, a white male attorney had arrived nearly 20 minutes late with no explanation, and Judge Barrett had let him off with a verbal warning. Today, however, his response was swift and severe. Despite the rising tension, Monica maintained her professionalism. She had spent years prosecuting complex cases, facing hardened criminals and skilled defense attorneys, but this moment felt like an entirely different challenge. It wasn't about her case or her credentials. It was about confronting an entrenched bias that was unfolding in real time. Judge Barrett's face was flushed with authority as he concluded, "If there are no further excuses, we will proceed with the issuance of this fine. Do you understand the court's decision, Miss Harris?" Monica's expression didn't waver. "I understand, Your Honor," she replied, her voice calm but resolute. "However, I must point out that the fine and your response seem inconsistent with how similar situations have been handled in this courtroom. As a federal prosecutor, I am familiar with the principles of equal justice under the law. It is my duty to ensure that those principles are upheld." Her words hung in the air, a quiet but firm challenge to the judge's authority. For the first time, Judge Barrett seemed to falter. His flushed face paled slightly as he registered the weight of Monica's statement. Still, he refused to acknowledge her point, instead shuffling papers on his desk to signal the end of the discussion. In the back of the courtroom, several people whispered to one another, their reactions ranging from admiration to disbelief. The court clerk, Mrs. Thompson, hesitated as she entered the file into the system, her fingers pausing over the keyboard. She had worked under Judge Barrett for over a decade and had seen her share of concerning moments, but something about this felt different. This felt wrong. Monica took a slow breath, her hands steady as she retrieved her documentation from the podium. She had no intention of letting this moment pass unnoticed. Every word the judge had spoken, every dismissive glance, and every action he had taken were now etched in her memory. These weren't just personal slights. They were pieces of evidence in a broader pattern of bias that needed to be addressed. As Monica stepped back from the podium, the courtroom's atmosphere remained charged. Judge Barrett moved on to the next case, but the weight of his decision lingered. Monica knew this was no ordinary day in court. What had started as a simple parking ticket dispute had now become something far greater, a moment that demanded action, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever faced similar treatment in a system meant to deliver justice equally. As the courtroom settled into an uneasy quiet, Monica Harris stepped back to the podium, her posture tall and composed. She took a deep breath, her years of experience as a federal prosecutor grounding her in the moment. Looking directly at Judge Barrett, she spoke in a voice that was calm, yet carried undeniable authority. "Your Honor," she began, holding up her badge for the courtroom to see, the gold insignia of the Department of Justice catching the light. "For the record, I am Assistant United States Attorney Monica Harris, currently serving in the Northern District of Georgia. This morning, I was delayed due to an urgent matter involving a federal case, the Thompson human trafficking prosecution. As I'm sure you are aware, this case has significant implications for justice in our state." The judge's face visibly shifted, his earlier certainty replaced by a flicker of unease. His gavel, which had rested firmly in his hand moments ago, now lay idle on the bench. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder as spectators absorbed this unexpected revelation. Monica continued, her tone steady and professional. "I respect this court and its procedures, but I must express my concern over what I've witnessed this morning. Your response to my tardiness, including the fine you imposed, appears inconsistent with the treatment afforded to other individuals in this courtroom. This discrepancy raises questions about the equitable application of justice." The judge stiffened, clearly unprepared for this level of directness. "Miss Harris," he began, but Monica didn't let him interrupt. "Your Honor, my position should not matter," she said firmly, her voice cutting through the room's tension. "What matters is that every person in this courtroom, regardless of their race, background, or perceived status, receives fair and equal treatment under the law. Unfortunately, the actions I've observed today suggest a different reality. Disparate treatment in any courtroom undermines the very principles of justice we are sworn to uphold." Her words carried weight, resonating with a diverse group of people seated on the courtroom benches. Some nodded quietly, their own experiences with systemic bias echoing in her statement. Others sat in stunned silence, watching as Monica stood her ground against a figure of authority. Monica reached into her briefcase, retrieving a small notebook. "I've documented several incidents during this session that indicate potential bias in the handling of cases, including inconsistencies in fines and the tone used with defendants. As a federal prosecutor, I have a responsibility to address these issues and ensure the justice system operates without prejudice." Judge Barrett's face paled as the room seemed to close in around him. His authority, so confidently wielded just moments before, now seemed fragile in the face of Monica's calm but unyielding resolve. She wasn't just speaking for herself. She was shining a light on systemic issues too long ignored, turning a simple municipal court appearance into a powerful call for change. The atmosphere in the courtroom grew heavy as Monica Harris, calm but resolute, stepped forward once again. Her voice, measured and confident, carried a weight that silenced the murmurs of the spectators. She knew the moment demanded not just words, but concrete action, a way to turn the unjust treatment she had experienced into a catalyst for meaningful change. "Your Honor," Monica began, her tone steady but firm, "I would like to make a formal proposal to address the concerns raised during today's proceedings. First, I will pay the $500 fine imposed upon me. While I strongly disagree with its justification, I will treat it as evidence of the systemic issues that must be addressed in this courtroom." Her decision to pay the fine surprised many in the room, and the judge shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Monica reached into her briefcase, retrieved her checkbook, and began writing out the payment with deliberate precision. "This fine," she continued, "will serve as documented proof of the disparate treatment I have observed here today. It is not an admission of guilt, but rather a demonstration of my commitment to holding this system accountable." Pausing to let her words sink in, Monica raised her gaze and addressed the courtroom as a whole. "Second," she said, "I request that this court initiate a comprehensive review of its records from the past 6 months. Specifically, I propose examining fines, sentences, and other decisions to identify potential demographic patterns. This data will provide an objective basis for understanding whether disparities exist in the treatment of defendants based on race, gender, or socioeconomic status." The judge's face paled and a murmur swept through the room. Monica's proposal was unprecedented, and its implications were clear. She was not simply fighting for herself, but challenging the very foundation of the court's practices. "Finally," she added, her voice growing stronger, "I suggest that all personnel in this courtroom, including judges, clerks, and bailiffs, undergo mandatory training on recognizing and addressing implicit bias. Such training is essential to ensure that everyone who enters this courtroom is treated with fairness and dignity, regardless of their background or appearance." Her words resonated deeply with those in the room. Spectators, many of whom had experienced or witnessed similar injustices, sat up straighter, their eyes fixed on Monica. The court clerk, Mrs. Thompson, paused her typing, her hands hovering over the keyboard as she absorbed the weight of Monica's proposals. Even James Wilson, the seasoned bailiff who had seen countless injustices play out in this very courtroom, nodded subtly in agreement. Judge Barrett, however, struggled to maintain his composure. He cleared his throat, attempting to reassert his authority. "Miss Harris," he began, his voice unsteady, "these are serious allegations, and this court does not tolerate such implications of bias." Monica interrupted him, her tone unwavering but respectful. "Your Honor, this is not about allegations. It is about evidence and accountability. I have spent my career as a federal prosecutor gathering facts, presenting cases, and advocating for justice. What I have observed today is part of a broader pattern that cannot be ignored. and as an officer of the court, it is my duty to ensure that justice is not only done, but seen to be done." She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a neatly compiled folder. "Here," she said, holding it up, "is a preliminary analysis of today's proceedings, including observations of differences in how defendants have been addressed and fined. I have also documented several instances where cases involving black defendants were handled more harshly than those involving white defendants for similar infractions." The tension in the room was palpable. Many of the spectators leaned forward in their seats, their expressions a mix of admiration and disbelief. Monica was doing something they had rarely, if ever, seen in a courtroom, standing up to systemic bias with professionalism and undeniable evidence. "Furthermore," Monica continued, her voice steady and deliberate, "I have already informed my office about the patterns I've observed. As a federal prosecutor, I have the authority and responsibility to report any behavior that undermines the principles of equal justice under the law. My office will be in touch regarding a formal review of this court's practices." Judge Barrett's face flushed with a mixture of anger and embarrassment. He fumbled with the papers on his desk, avoiding Monica's gaze. The room seemed to close in around him, as the weight of her words and the strength of her resolve became undeniable. Monica concluded, "This is not about one judge or one courtroom. It is about ensuring that our justice system works for everyone, not just a select few. Bias, whether conscious or unconscious, has no place in our courts. I stand here today, not just for myself, but for every person who has been unfairly judged or disproportionately punished. Change begins with accountability, and accountability begins now." The courtroom erupted into murmurs, a wave of reactions sweeping through the benches. Some defendants nodded in solidarity, while others whispered excitedly to one another. Mrs. Thompson, visibly moved, reached for a notebook she kept in her desk drawer, a personal log of concerning incidents she had witnessed over the years. James Wilson took a subtle step closer to the judge's bench, as though silently affirming Monica's call for change. Judge Barrett, visibly shaken, attempted to regain control. "This court will take your concerns under advisement, Miss Harris," he said, his voice strained. But the words rang hollow in the wake of Monica's powerful statements. As Monica handed her check to the clerk and gathered her belongings, she looked around the room. She could see the impact her actions had made, the hope in the eyes of the spectators, the thoughtful expression on Mrs. Thompson's face, and even the subtle shift in Judge Barrett's demeanor. What had started as a simple municipal court appearance had become a pivotal moment. Monica had not only stood up to injustice, but had also laid the foundation for systemic change, inspiring everyone in the room to reconsider what fairness and equality in the justice system truly meant. Monica Harris's courageous stand in Judge Barrett's courtroom quickly became the catalyst for something much larger. By the end of the day, news of the incident had begun to spread throughout the local legal community. Word of her professionalism and her direct confrontation of systemic bias reached her peers, prompting phone calls and emails from other attorneys, clerks, and court officers who had long felt silenced by the pervasive iniquities in the municipal court system. Within hours, the story had taken on a life of its own. Local reporters caught wind of the incident, with headlines like "Federal Prosecutor Calls Out Racial Bias in Municipal Court" and "Atlanta Judge Faces Allegations of Unequal Justice," appearing across news outlets. Social media platforms amplified the narrative, with Monica's actions becoming a rallying cry for legal reform advocates and community leaders alike. One widely shared post read, "She didn't just pay the fine, she exposed the system." As the story gained momentum, more people began coming forward with their own accounts of disparities in Judge Barrett's courtroom. Defendants, attorneys, and even court staff provided testimonies, recounting years of biased decisions, disproportionately high fines for minority defendants, and dismissive treatment of individuals based on their race or socioeconomic status. Among those who spoke out was Mrs. Thompson, the longtime court clerk who had been present during Monica's hearing. She shared her detailed personal log, which documented years of patterns she had noticed under Judge Barrett's tenure. "I wasn't in a position to speak up before," she admitted in an interview with a local reporter. "But after what Monica did, I realized I couldn't stay silent anymore." James Wilson, the courtroom bailiff, also contributed his observations. In a written statement to the Judicial Review Board, he described witnessing repeated instances where black defendants were fined more heavily or reprimanded more harshly than their white counterparts for similar offenses. "It was a pattern," he wrote. "Over and over, I saw the same disparities. We all did." The evidence was damning. Over the following weeks, investigators combed through 6 months of court records uncovering clear statistical disparities. Cases involving black defendants were shown to result in fines averaging 45% higher than those involving white defendants. Requests for payment plans, often made by low-income defendants, were denied 3 times more frequently for black individuals. Additionally, interruptions during defendants' testimonies were significantly higher for minorities, highlighting the broader cultural biases at play in the courtroom. As the investigation deepened, the Judicial Review Board initiated formal proceedings against Judge Barrett. Though he had served on the bench for decades, his record now faced intense scrutiny. Court officials uncovered more troubling data, discrepancies in sentencing, selective leniency for affluent defendants, and a pattern of hostility toward women and minorities appearing in his courtroom. These revelations painted a picture of a justice system that had failed to uphold its foundational principles of fairness and equality. Monica's actions also inspired a broader movement within the legal community. Local attorneys began organizing workshops to train young lawyers on how to recognize and address bias in the courtroom. Community leaders used the momentum to demand reforms at the municipal and state levels, pushing for standardized guidelines on fines and sentencing to prevent subjective bias. Meanwhile, Monica herself became an informal spokesperson for judicial reform. Though she continued her work as a federal prosecutor, her office became a gathering point for individuals who wanted to share their own experiences and collaborate on meaningful change. Monica's ability to navigate the intersection of law and advocacy made her a powerful voice in the movement. She often reminded those who reached out to her, "This isn't about one judge, it's about an entire system that needs to be rebuilt." As the investigation unfolded, Judge Barrett attempted to defend his record, claiming he had always treated defendants equally and that any perceived bias was unintentional. However, the overwhelming evidence and the growing public pressure made it clear that his courtroom practices could no longer be ignored. By the end of the investigation, the Judicial Review Board recommended disciplinary actions, including suspension and mandatory bias training. Discussions about Judge Barrett's possible resignation also surfaced, as community trust in his ability to serve fairly had been irreparably damaged. The ripple effects extended beyond Judge Barrett. Other judges in Atlanta began reviewing their own court practices, with many implementing immediate reforms, such as stricter monitoring of sentencing patterns and more transparent fine structures. The municipal court system as a whole faced increased scrutiny, with demands for systemic changes that would ensure fairness for all defendants. Monica's stand had accomplished what many thought impossible, a genuine reckoning within the justice system. What started as a simple parking ticket dispute had grown into a transformative movement for accountability and equality. Through her courage, professionalism, and refusal to back down, Monica had sparked a wave of change that would resonate far beyond the walls of Judge Barrett's courtroom. The incident involving Monica Harris became a turning point for the municipal court system, igniting a wave of reforms aimed at addressing systemic bias. In the wake of the investigation, the Judicial Review Board introduced sweeping changes to restore public trust and ensure fairness in court practices. Among these changes were new oversight mechanisms requiring detailed documentation of fines, sentencing, and courtroom procedures. These records would be reviewed quarterly by an independent commission to identify and address potential patterns of bias. Mandatory training programs were also implemented for all court personnel, including judges, clerks, and bailiffs. These programs focused on recognizing and mitigating implicit bias, fostering cultural sensitivity, and promoting equitable treatment for all defendants. The training emphasized the importance of treating each individual with respect, regardless of race, gender, or socioeconomic status. Additionally, the courts adopted standardized guidelines for fines and sentencing, reducing the discretionary power that had allowed disparities to flourish. Judge Barrett, facing mounting evidence and growing public pressure, ultimately stepped down from his position. His resignation marked a symbolic victory for those fighting for justice reform, underscoring the need for accountability at all levels of the judiciary. Although he attempted to defend his record, the overwhelming documentation of his biased practices made it clear that change was inevitable. Monica Harris emerged as a central figure in the push for reform. Her actions and steadfast resolve transformed her from a federal prosecutor into a powerful symbol of justice and equality. She was invited to lead discussions on judicial reform and worked closely with legal advocacy groups to develop policies aimed at creating a more transparent and equitable justice system. Her experience became a case study in how one person's courage could spark systemic change. The effects of Monica's stand extended beyond Judge Barrett's courtroom. Other courts in Atlanta and across the state began implementing similar reforms, inspired by the changes in the municipal system. The legal community rallied around her, creating resources and tools for attorneys and defendants to report and challenge biased practices. 3 months after the incident, Monica walked into a newly renovated courthouse, where a sign read, "Center for Judicial Education and Equality Training." It was a visible reminder of the impact of her actions. Monica's framed receipt for the $500 fine hung in her office, a symbol of the fight for fairness and the transformative power of standing up against injustice. Her story had not only reshaped a courtroom, but had begun to reimagine what justice could truly mean. Monica Harris's stand in Judge Barrett's courtroom became a catalyst for lasting change. Her courage not only led to immediate judicial reforms, but also inspired a broader movement focused on addressing systemic bias in the justice system. Legal reforms were implemented across multiple courts, introducing mandatory training programs on implicit bias and creating standardized sentencing guidelines. Monica's story became a cornerstone of educational programs for law students and young attorneys, highlighting the importance of challenging injustice from within the system. Recognizing her pivotal role, Monica was invited to chair a statewide commission on court reform, where she worked to develop policies promoting transparency, equity, and accountability. Her leadership energized a new generation of civil rights advocates who saw her as a symbol of what was possible when courage and professionalism intersect. Monica's actions demonstrated that a single voice could ripple into systemic change, proving that standing up for justice in one moment could transform an entire system for years to come.